The air at 23,000 feet over the North Sea was so cold it burned. Lieutenant James Barlow could feel it even through his leather gloves, even through the layered fleece and wool and canvas that wrapped him like armor against the altitude. His breath came in clouds inside the oxygen mask, each exhalation frosting immediately on the rubber seal pressed against his face. The sun was climbing somewhere to the east, still low and pale, casting long shadows across the bomber formation that stretched in both directions like a flight of migrating birds. Below, the sea was a sheet of hammered steel, flat and colorless, and above, the contrails of 36 B-17 flying fortresses drew white lines across a sky so blue it seemed artificial. Barlow sat in the pilot's seat of the aircraft designated Baker 27, his hands resting lightly on the yoke, his eyes moving in a steady rhythm between the instruments, the formation, and the horizon. To his right, co-pilot Lieutenant Eugene Pritchard held the same posture, the same vigilance. Behind them, through the narrow passage that connected the flight deck to the rest of the fuselage, the rest of the crew occupied their stations in a silence broken only by the thunder of 4 Wright Cyclone engines and the occasional crackle of interphone chatter. Bombardier 2nd Lieutenant David Keller and Navigator 2nd Lieutenant Raymond Frost sat below and ahead in the nose compartment, surrounded by plexiglass and sky, their charts and bomb sight and instruments laid out in careful order. Above and behind in the top turret, Staff Sergeant Michael Quinn scanned the heavens for the dark shapes that everyone knew were coming. In the waist, the ball turret, and the tail, 5 more men watched and waited, each alone with the sound of wind and engines and the thin mechanical voice of their crewmates. They were 3 hours into the mission. The target was a synthetic oil refinery deep in Germany, one of dozens that fed the fuel-starved Wehrmacht. The briefing that morning had been routine in the way all briefings had become routine by the winter of 1944. A recitation of routes and altitudes and expected flak concentrations of fighter activity and rally points and emergency procedures. The intelligence officer had pointed at the map with a wooden stick and told them what they already knew, that losses were expected to be moderate to heavy, that the Luftwaffe was still capable of putting up significant resistance despite the advancing Allied armies, that every mission mattered and every man was necessary. Barlow had listened and nodded and made notes on his knee pad, and then he had walked out into the cold English dawn with his crew and climbed into the airplane that had carried them through 18 missions and would, if luck held, carry them through many more. He had grown up in a place very different from this. The farm in southern Ohio had been small and unsuccessful, worked by his father and his older brother while Barlow attended school and helped where he could. The Depression had hollowed out the region, left the roads dusty and the towns half empty, and by the time he turned 17, he knew that the land would not support him. He had thought about college but lacked the money. He had thought about factory work but lacked the temperament. When the war came, it came as an answer to a question he had not yet learned to ask. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in the summer of 1942, drawn by the promise of flight and the clarity of purpose that comes with a uniform and a mission. The training had been rigorous and impersonal, a sequence of airfields and classrooms and check rides that transformed him from a farm boy into a pilot, from a civilian into an officer. He had learned to fly the B-17 at MacDill Field in Florida, mastering the heavy bomber's peculiar combination of grace and stubbornness, its tendency to wallow in turbulence, and its surprising responsiveness when handled correctly. He had learned formation flying and instrument flying and night flying, had learned to trust his co-pilot and his crew and the mechanics who kept the engines running and the hydraulics pressurized. He had arrived in England in August of 1944, assigned to the 390th Bomb Group at Framlingham, and had flown his first mission a week later. The fear that accompanied that first flight had been overwhelming, a physical sensation that sat in his chest and made his hands shake on the controls. But he had done his job, had held his position in the formation, had brought his crew home, and the fear had diminished with each subsequent mission until it became something manageable, a companion rather than a master. He had learned to read the sky, to recognize the black puffs of flak and the glint of sunlight on a canopy that meant fighters inbound. He had learned the sound of his engines so well that he could detect the slightest irregularity, the smallest change in pitch or rhythm that might signal trouble. He had learned to live with the knowledge that on any given day he might not return, that the men beside him might not return, and that this was simply the nature of the work they had chosen or been chosen for. The 390th Bomb Group was part of the 8th Air Force, the vast aerial armada that had spent the past 2 years systematically dismantling Germany's ability to wage war. Based in East Anglia, the 8th operated from a network of airfields scattered across the flat English countryside, launching missions that sent hundreds of bombers deep into occupied Europe. The strategy was one of attrition and precision, of destroying the industrial capacity that fed the German military machine. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, marshalling yards, each was a target, each a piece of the larger puzzle. The cost had been staggering. Thousands of aircraft lost, tens of thousands of airmen killed or captured, but the strategy had worked. By the winter of 1944, Germany was reeling, its cities in ruins, its armies retreating on every front. The war would end, everyone said, within months. The only question was how many more men would die before it did. Barlow checked his watch. They were approaching the coast of Holland, the point where the North Sea gave way to land and the flak batteries began. He scanned the formation, noting the tight spacing, the steady progress. The weather was clear, a blessing and a curse. Clear skies meant accurate bombing, but also made them visible to every gun crew and fighter pilot between here and the target. He toggled the interphone. Navigator pilot, time to enemy coast? Frost's voice came back immediately, calm and precise. Pilot, navigator, 12 minutes. Roger. Barlow settled back into his seat, his eyes moving again across the instruments. Oil pressure steady, fuel flow normal, cylinder head temperatures in the green. Pritchard was doing the same beside him, a mirror image. The two of them performing a ritual so familiar it required no thought. The formation began a gentle turn to the southeast, aligning with the initial point from which they would begin their bomb run. The sun was higher now, bright and cold, and the contrails streamed behind each aircraft like banners. The first flak appeared as they crossed the coast, black bursts that blossomed in clusters 1,000 feet below and to the left, ranging shots from batteries that were trying to find the altitude. Barlow watched without expression. The shells were too low to worry about, and the gunners would adjust, but for now they were safe. He had long since stopped flinching at the sight of flak. It was simply part of the environment, like weather or turbulence, something to be noted and avoided if possible but not feared. The formation tightened slightly, each pilot edging closer to his wingman, seeking the protection of concentrated firepower. In the nose, Keller would be preparing the bomb site, making the minute adjustments that would, in theory, place their bombs on target. In the radio room, the operator would be monitoring frequencies, listening for recalls or updates. In the turrets and waist positions, the gunners would be scanning the sky, their gloved hands resting on the charging handles of their 50s. The land below was a patchwork of fields and villages, roads and canals, all rendered abstract by altitude. Barlow could see smoke rising from a town to the north. Whether from a previous raid or some other cause, he could not tell. The war had made the landscape unreadable, transformed it into a map of destruction and resistance. He thought briefly of the people down there, the Dutch civilians who watched the bombers pass overhead day after day, who lived under occupation and rationing and the constant threat of violence. He thought of them, and then put the thought aside. There was no room for such considerations at 23,000 feet, with a bomb bay full of high explosive and 400 miles of hostile territory ahead. They flew on. The minutes accumulated. The flak intensified as they penetrated deeper into German-controlled airspace. The black bursts creeping closer, the concussions occasionally strong enough to rock the aircraft. Barlow held the formation, made the small corrections necessary to compensate for wind and turbulence, and waited. The interphone chatter increased slightly. Reports of fighter activity to the north, of flak concentrations ahead, of mechanical problems in other aircraft. One bomber from another group peeled off and began a slow descent, streaming fuel from a punctured wing tank. Barlow watched it go, watched the crew bail out one by one, the parachutes blossoming white against the brown earth. And then he looked away. The target was 60 miles ahead when the Focke-Wulfs came. They came out of the sun, a flight of 6 or 8 or possibly more, diving at tremendous speed, their wings flickering with the muzzle flashes of cannons and machine guns. The formation erupted in defensive fire, the turrets tracking and the waist guns hammering, the sky suddenly full of tracers and smoke, and the scream of engines at full throttle. Barlow held his position, felt the aircraft shudder as Quinn opened up with the top turret, felt the concussion of a fighter passing within feet of the cockpit. One of the Focke-Wulfs pulled up sharply and exploded, struck by concentrated fire from multiple bombers. Another dove threw the formation and kept diving, trailing smoke. The rest climbed and came around for another pass. Keller's voice crackled on the interphone, urgent but controlled. "Fighters 12 o'clock level, coming in fast." Barlow saw them, 3 dark shapes boring straight in, head-on attacks that forced the bomber pilots to choose between breaking formation or holding course. He held course. The fighters grew larger, resolved into distinct aircraft with propeller discs and wing-mounted cannons, and then they were firing, the rounds walking across the sky toward Baker 27 with a peculiar lazy beauty that belied their lethality. Barlow felt the aircraft buck as something struck the fuselage, heard a sharp crack, and then the fighters were past and climbing away, and he was checking the instruments again, looking for damage. "Everybody okay? Report in." The responses came one by one, the crew accounting for themselves. No casualties. Some damage to the waist. A hydraulic line severed, but nothing catastrophic. Barlow exhaled slowly and scanned the formation. 2 bombers were gone, one spinning down with most of its left wing missing, the other simply absent, vanished in the chaos. He did not see parachutes. The rest of the formation closed up, filling the gaps, and flew on. The fighters made one more pass and then disappeared, either low on fuel or ammunition or deterred by the defensive fire. The flak intensified to compensate, the German gunners finding the range now, the bursts walking through the formation in patterns of black and orange. Barlow felt the concussions as shells detonated nearby, felt the aircraft lift and drop in the turbulence. A fragment struck the windscreen directly in front of him, starring the plexiglass but not penetrating. He ignored it. Pritchard glanced over and said nothing. They were 15 miles from the initial point, the spot where they would turn onto the bomb run and fly straight and level for the next 10 minutes, while Keller guided them to the target. It was the most dangerous phase of the mission, the time when evasive action was impossible, and the flak batteries could predict their course exactly. The turn came smoothly, the entire formation wheeling in unison, and then they were on the bomb run, and Keller had control of the aircraft through the bomb site linkage, and there was nothing for Barlow to do but sit and wait and hope. The flak was a solid wall now, a forest of bursts that filled the sky, ahead and on all sides, and the formation flew into it without hesitation. Barlow felt the aircraft shudder continuously, felt the fragments pinging off the fuselage and wings, and he watched the instruments and prayed that nothing vital would be hit. 1 engine, 2 engines, 3 engines. He could bring them home on 3 engines, possibly on 2 if they lightened the load, but a fuel tank, a control cable, a hydraulic system, those were harder to compensate for. The bomber to his left took a direct hit, the shell detonating somewhere in the bomb bay, and the aircraft simply came apart, the wings folding up, and the fuselage breaking in half, and the pieces tumbling earthward in a cloud of debris. Barlow looked away. Beside him, Pritchard whispered something inaudible. The flak intensified. The aircraft bucked and swayed. Keller's voice, steady and detached, counted down the seconds to release. 30 seconds. 20. 10. Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of ordnance fell free, and Barlow felt the controls respond as he took command again, initiating the turn away from the target. The formation scattered slightly, each pilot eager to leave the killing zone, and then they were clear, and the flak was falling behind, and Barlow allowed himself a moment of relief. The target was obscured by smoke and flame, the bombs from 30 aircraft having found their mark, and whatever had been there was now destroyed or damaged beyond repair. They turned for home. The flight back across Germany was quieter, the flak sporadic, the fighters absent or engaged elsewhere. The formation reformed, the surviving aircraft finding their positions, and settled into the long cruise back to England. Barlow ran through the fuel calculations, checked the damage reports from the crew, and determined that they would make it back without difficulty barring further incident. The hydraulic leak had been contained. The hole in the waist was not affecting flight. Characteristics: The engines were running smoothly. He allowed himself to relax slightly, though not completely. They were still over enemy territory, still vulnerable, and the war had taught him that assumption of safety was the surest path to disaster. They were somewhere over the Netherlands, perhaps 40 minutes from the coast, when the second attack came. It was a single fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf-109, and it came from directly ahead and above, diving out of a cloud layer that Barlow had not realized was there. The pilot was either very skilled or very desperate, because he held his course until the last possible moment, until his cannons could not miss, and then he fired. Barlow saw the flashes, saw the tracers arcing toward the cockpit, and there was no time to react, no time to do anything but watch as the rounds struck the nose of the aircraft and kept coming. The entire plexiglass nose compartment disintegrated. One moment it was there, solid and intact, and the next it was simply gone, blown away in a maelstrom of cannon fire and exploding fragments. The slipstream roared into the fuselage with a violence that defied description, a hurricane of wind and noise that filled the cockpit and tore at everything not secured. Barlow felt the yoke go slack in his hands, felt the aircraft pitch down sharply, and he hauled back on the controls with all his strength, not understanding yet what had happened, knowing only that they were in desperate trouble. The wind was a physical thing, a presence that clawed at his face and filled his mouth and made breathing impossible. He could not see, could not hear, could only hold the yoke and pull and hope that the control surfaces were still responding. Beside him, Pritchard was doing the same, both men straining against the forces trying to tear the bomber out of the sky. The instruments were unreadable, the needles dancing wildly, and the noise was so overwhelming that thought itself became difficult. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose began to come up. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, the airframe protesting, but it responded. Barlow trimmed the elevator, feeling for the neutral point, and gradually the dive arrested and they leveled off. 2,000 feet below their original altitude and falling out of formation, but still flying. He risked a glance forward and saw nothing but sky and the jagged remains of the nose compartment, the metal framework twisted and bent, the control cables visible where they ran along the floor, and no sign whatsoever of Keller or Frost. His mind went blank for a moment, unable to process what he was seeing. The nose was gone. The bombardier and navigator were gone. The entire front section of the aircraft had been obliterated, and yet the bomber was still responding to the controls, still flying, because somehow the cables that ran from the yoke to the tail had survived intact. He stared at those cables, thin strands of braided steel running along the exposed framework, flexing and shifting with each movement of the yoke, and he understood that those cables were all that stood between his crew and oblivion. Pritchard's voice came through the interphone, barely audible over the wind. "Jesus Christ, Jim, the whole nose is gone." "I know." Keller and Frost, "I know." There was nothing else to say. The two men were gone, either killed instantly by the cannon fire or blown out of the aircraft when the nose disintegrated. There would be no parachutes, no possibility of survival. Barlow felt the knowledge settle into his chest, cold and final, but he could not afford to think about it now. He had 8 men still alive, still depending on him, and he had to get them home. The formation was above and ahead, continuing toward the coast without them. Standard procedure was to stay with the formation to seek the protection of the group's combined firepower, but that was no longer possible. Baker 2-7 could not climb back to altitude, not with the drag created by the missing nose section, not with the hurricane of wind pouring into the cockpit. They were on their own, alone over enemy territory in a crippled aircraft, and their only chance was to stay low and fast and hope they could reach the coast before the fighters found them again. Barlow pushed the throttles forward, felt the engines respond, and pointed the nose west. The airspeed climbed to 220 miles per hour, faster than was safe but necessary. The aircraft vibrated continuously, the wind screaming through the open nose, and every surface that could rattle did. He could feel the cold now, the temperature at 7,000 feet still well below zero, and his face was going numb despite the leather helmet and goggles. Pritchard hunched forward in his seat, trying to minimize his exposure to the slipstream, and together they flew on. The interphone crackled, Quinn's voice from the top turret. "Pilot, any instructions?" Barlow thought about it. What could he tell them? Stay alert. Watch for fighters. Pray. "Just hold on," he said finally. "We're heading for the coast. It's about 30 minutes. Stay on the guns." Roger. The minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Barlow's world narrowed to the instruments, the horizon and the cables running along the floor of what had been the nose compartment. He watched those cables as though his life depended on it, which it did, noting every shift and flex, looking for signs of fraying or damage. They were intact, they were holding, but they were also exposed to the wind and the cold and the vibration, and any one of them could fail at any moment. If the elevator cable parted, the aircraft would pitch uncontrollably. If the rudder cable failed, they would enter a spin from which recovery would be impossible. He tried not to think about it, tried to focus on flying, but the knowledge was there, inescapable. Pritchard pointed ahead and to the left. Barlow followed his gaze and saw smoke rising from the ground, a town burning. Whether from their own bombs or another mission, he did not know. The landscape scrolled past beneath them, fields and forests and roads, all peaceful from this altitude, all unmarked by the violence that had carved up the nose of his aircraft and killed 2 of his crew. He thought of Keller, a quiet man from Pennsylvania who had wanted to be a teacher before the war. He thought of Frost, who had a wife and a young daughter he had never met, born while he was overseas. He thought of them and then forced himself to stop because grief was a luxury he could not afford. The radio operator, Sergeant Harris, came on the interphone. "Pilot, radio. I'm getting calls from the group. They're asking our status. Tell them we've lost the nose and 2 crew. We're heading for the coast at low altitude. We'll make it." Roger. Would they make it? Barlow did not know. The aircraft was responding, but every moment of flight brought them closer to some critical failure. The cables were holding, but for how long? The engines were running, but they were being pushed beyond normal limits. The crew was alive, but they were in shock, functioning on training and adrenaline. He tightened his grip on the yoke and flew on. They crossed a canal, a ribbon of dark water that ran north to south, and Barlow recognized it from the maps. They were 20 miles from the coast, perhaps 15 minutes if they could maintain speed. The flak had stopped, the German batteries either out of range or conserving ammunition for more lucrative targets. The sky was empty, no fighters visible, and he allowed himself a fragment of hope. 15 minutes. They could survive. 15 minutes. The control cables shifted as he made a minor correction, and he watched them with the intensity of a man watching a fuse burn down. They were frayed in places, the individual strands beginning to separate, and he realized with a sick certainty that they would not last much longer. The vibration was too severe, the stress too great. He could see the cables sawing back and forth across the jagged metal edges of the destroyed nose framework, abrading with each movement, and he understood that he had to reduce the stress, had to fly as smoothly as possible, minimizing any control inputs that would flex the cables unnecessarily. He called Pritchard over. "Gene, listen, the cables are starting to fray. We need to hand fly this thing as gently as possible. No sudden movements. Trim it out as best we can and just hold it steady." Pritchard nodded, his face pale but composed. Together, they worked the trim wheels, adjusting the elevator and rudder trim until the aircraft was flying nearly hands-off, the yoke requiring only the lightest touch to maintain heading and altitude. It helped. The cables stopped flexing quite so violently, but Barlow knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They were still 10 minutes from the coast, and 10 minutes was an eternity. The interphone came alive again, Quinn reporting fighters to the north, high and heading east, probably German aircraft returning from some engagement. They did not turn toward Baker 27, and Barlow watched them go with relief. Every moment without combat was a moment closer to safety. He checked the fuel gauges, did the mental arithmetic, and confirmed that they had enough to reach England. The North Sea would be the next hurdle, 20 miles of water with no place to land if the engines quit or the cables failed. But one problem at a time. First, the coast. It appeared as a gray line on the horizon, the demarcation between land and sea, and Barlow felt a wave of emotion he could not quite name. Relief? Yes. But also something deeper, a recognition that they had come through the worst and might yet survive. He keyed the interphone. "Crew pilot, we've got the coast in sight. 5 minutes." The acknowledgments came back, the voices of 8 men who had trusted him to bring them home, and who were beginning to believe he might actually do it. Barlow focused on the flying, on keeping the aircraft steady, on nursing the fraying cables through just a few more minutes of flight. The coastline grew larger, resolved into beaches and dunes, and the white caps of waves breaking against the shore. And then they were over the water and heading northwest toward England. The North Sea stretched out beneath them, cold and gray and featureless. Barlow descended to 3,000 feet, low enough that a ditching might be survivable, high enough that they had some margin for error. The cables held. The engines continued their steady roar. The wind screamed through the open nose, unabated, and Barlow's face was numb, and his hands were cramping from the cold and the tension. But he did not let go of the yoke. Pritchard pointed ahead. Land. The coast of England appearing out of the haze like a promise. They were almost there. Barlow allowed himself to believe it, allowed himself to imagine. The wheels touching down on the runway at Framlingham, the engines shutting down, the crew climbing out alive. He could see it in his mind, could feel the relief that would come with solid ground beneath his feet. The rudder cable parted with a sound like a gunshot. The aircraft yawed violently to the left, the nose swinging despite Barlow's attempts to correct with aileron. He stamped on the right rudder pedal and felt nothing, no resistance, no response. The cable was gone, sheared through by the vibration and the friction, and now they were flying an aircraft with no directional control, the rudder flapping free in the slipstream. Pritchard saw it immediately, saw the loose cable whipping back through the open nose compartment. And his eyes met Barlow's with the shared understanding that they were in the final crisis. "Gene, can you hold it with aileron and throttle?" "I'll try." They experimented, Barlow feeding in left aileron to counter the yaw, Pritchard adjusting the throttles to balance the thrust, and between them they found a precarious equilibrium that kept the nose pointed roughly in the right direction. It was unstable and exhausting, requiring constant attention, but it worked. The English coast was 5 miles ahead, the airfield at Framlingham perhaps 10 miles beyond that. They could make it if nothing else failed, if the elevator cable held, if the engines kept running, if their strength held out. Barlow's arms were shaking with fatigue, the muscles cramping from the sustained effort of holding the aircraft level. Pritchard was in the same condition, sweat running down his face despite the cold, his jaw clenched with concentration, but neither man spoke. Neither suggested giving up or bailing out, because the crew in the back was still alive and still depending on them, and there was no other choice but to continue. They crossed the English coast at 2,000 feet, the fields and hedgerows of East Anglia passing beneath them, familiar and safe. Barlow could see other aircraft in the distance, the returning bombers making their way back to their bases, and the sight gave him strength. They were not alone. They had made it this far. They would make it the rest of the way. Framlingham appeared ahead, the runway visible, the tower surely aware of their condition by now. Harris had been broadcasting their situation, requesting priority landing, and the field would be standing by with crash equipment and ambulances. Barlow set up for a long, straight-in approach, knowing that any turn would be difficult to control, that his margin for error was non-existent. He lowered the landing gear, felt the aircraft slow and the nose want to drop, and adjusted the trim to compensate. The elevator cable was still holding. He could see it, frayed nearly through, just a few strands of steel still intact, but holding. Pritchard called out the altitudes. 1,000 feet, 500, 300. Barlow eased the throttles back, felt the aircraft settle, aimed for the numbers at the end of the runway. The ground rose to meet them faster than he wanted, and he hauled back on the yoke with the last of his strength, flaring the aircraft, feeling for the wheels. They touched down hard, the main gear slamming onto the concrete, and then the nose wheel followed, and they were rolling, still moving fast, Barlow standing on the brakes and praying they would hold. The aircraft slowed, the end of the runway approaching, and then they were stopped, engines idling, the wind still screaming through the missing nose, and it was over. Barlow sat for a moment, unable to move, unable to process that they were on the ground and alive. Pritchard was beside him, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. Behind them, the crew was already moving, opening hatches, climbing out, eager to escape the crippled bomber. Barlow released his harness, pulled off his oxygen mask, and stood on legs that barely supported him. He looked forward at the open nose, at the cables that had carried them home, and he saw that the elevator cable had parted completely, the two ends lying separated on the floor, frayed through to nothing. If they had landed 30 seconds later, if the approach had been 1 degree steeper, if he had pulled back just a fraction harder, the cable would have failed and they would have crashed. He climbed down from the aircraft and stood on the tarmac, surrounded by his crew, surrounded by the emergency personnel who had rushed to meet them. Someone was asking him questions, but he could not hear them over the ringing in his ears. He looked at the faces of the 8 men who had survived, saw the same shock and exhaustion and disbelief that he felt, and he nodded to them, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect and shared understanding. The debriefing came later, after the medical checks, after the hot coffee and the cigarettes, and the slow return to something resembling normalcy. Barlow told the intelligence officers what had happened, described the fighter attack and the destruction of the nose and the flight home with the cables exposed and fraying. They listened and took notes and asked questions, and he answered as best he could, though much of it was already blurring in his memory, the details softening and rearranging themselves into something more coherent than the chaos had actually been. The photographs came the next day, taken by the ground crew who had examined Baker 27 after the landing. The images showed the extent of the damage, the entire nose section obliterated, the framework bent and torn, the control cables visible running along the floor with just inches of clearance on either side. The engineering officer who examined the aircraft said that the chances of those cables surviving intact for the duration of the flight were almost non-existent, that the vibration and the wind and the sharp edges should have cut through them within minutes. He called it extraordinary. He called it miraculous. Barlow called it luck and left it at that. Keller and Frost were listed as killed in action, their families notified, their belongings packed and shipped home. Barlow wrote letters to their next of kin, trying to find words adequate to the loss and failing, settling finally for simple statements of fact and respect. They had died doing their duty. They had been good men. They would be missed. The letters felt insufficient, hollow, but he sent them anyway because it was all he could do. Baker 27 was repaired over the following weeks, the nose section rebuilt, the cables replaced, the damage patched and painted over until the aircraft looked almost as it had before. Barlow flew it again with a new bombardier and navigator, and the missions continued, each one another step toward the end of the war. He flew 35 missions in total, completing his tour in March of 1945, and he came home to Ohio and tried to resume the life he had left behind. The farm was still there, still small and unsuccessful, and he found work in a factory and married a woman from the next town over and raised 2 children who never quite understood what their father had done in the war. He did not speak of it often. The memories were too raw, too complicated, too bound up with loss and fear and a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than the physical. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would think about that flight across the North Sea, about the cables that had held when they should not have, about the men who had trusted him, and the 2 who had not made it home. He would think about the bomber, nose open to the sky, flying on nothing but frayed steel and determination, and he would remember what it felt like to be 23 years old and responsible for the lives of 9 other men, and terrified beyond measure, and doing the job anyway, because there was no other choice. The war ended in May of 1945. Germany surrendered, the camps were liberated, the world began the long process of rebuilding and reckoning with what had been done and what had been lost. Barlow watched from a distance, grateful to have survived, haunted by those who had not. The B-17s were scrapped or sold or placed in museums, relics of a conflict that had consumed millions of lives and reshaped the world. Baker 27 ended its days in a scrapyard in Arizona, cut apart for aluminum, its history forgotten by all but the men who had flown it. But the story remained, passed down through the years, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. The bomber that lost its nose and flew home anyway. The crew that survived when survival seemed impossible. The cables that held when they should have failed. It became a story about resilience and skill, and the thin line between life and death that every combat airman walked. It became a reminder that wars are fought not by nations or ideologies, but by individual human beings, young men and women who face fear and chaos, and make split-second decisions that ripple through the rest of their lives. Barlow died in 1989, an old man far removed from the pilot he had been, and his obituary mentioned his service in the war, but did not elaborate. The details were lost to time, forgotten or never recorded until researchers began piecing together the stories of the 8th Air Force and found the mission reports and the photographs and the testimony of the surviving crew members. They reconstructed what had happened that day over the Netherlands, and they marveled at the improbability of it, at the narrow margin by which 8 men had survived. The lesson, if there was one, was simple and terrible. War demands everything from those who fight it, strips away illusions, reveals the depths of human courage and the limits of human endurance. It shows us what we are capable of, both the nobility and the horror, and it leaves scars that never fully heal. The men who flew the bombers over Europe knew this. They lived it every day, every mission, every moment that they climbed into their aircraft and headed east toward the enemy. They did not do it for glory or recognition or even patriotism, though those things played their part. They did it because it was their job, because their friends were beside them, because someone had to, and they had been chosen. James Barlow brought his crew home that day, not because he was a hero, though he was, but because he refused to quit, because the alternative was unthinkable, because the cables held just long enough, and he had the skill and the luck to make use of that small grace. He flew 10 minutes pulling bare cables through the sky above a hostile land, and he landed with nothing to spare, and he went on to fly again and again until the war was over and he could go home. That was the reality of it, unglamorous and brutal and profoundly human, and it deserves to be remembered not as a tale of adventure, but as a testament to the cost of conflict and the quiet courage of ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things.